Power becomes dangerous when applause convinces a borrowed voice that it was born original. Rain struck the 38th floor windows of Aurelia Broadcast Center in silver sheets, blurring the taillights along Peachtree Street into red ribbons. Beyond the glass, Atlanta's towers glittered above the storm, their blue and gold office lights looking warmer than the marriage reflected in the window. Tonight, she would be decoration. At 8:42 p.m., 18 minutes before the live broadcast, Ayanna Pembroke stood beneath a row of white dressing room bulbs that gave off more heat than comfort. Aurelia Network had assembled a $22 million production, sponsorship, and national media package for Legacy Without Limits, a 90-minute primetime special backed by Cartier, Lincoln, and Northstar Private Wealth. The room smelled of citrus setting spray, hot electrical cables, and the bitter Colombian coffee cooling beside the makeup station. Smile for the cameras. Ayanna wore a sharply tailored black suit with a satin lapel, small diamond studs, and the calm expression of a woman who had learned never to donate emotion to people who intended to sell it. 3 stations away, Corinne Fairchild sat in a champagne silk dress while 2 stylists adjusted the fabric so it caught the key light without creating glare. A producer had placed Corinne's chair 12 inches closer to center frame and angled Ayanna's seat toward the edge of the set. Corinne got the light. Gideon Devereux entered in a $14,800 navy Brioni suit, checking the reflection of his tie in a dark monitor before acknowledging anyone else. He crossed the 16-foot room to straighten Corinne's microphone, asked whether the studio temperature suited her, and promised the director would favor her left profile. He did not ask Ayanna whether her microphone worked. That was the message. On the makeup counter, Ayanna found the revised cue sheet beneath a silver Aurelia folder. Her original 47 lines had been reduced to 6, while 3 questions about the company's first years had been reassigned to Corinne. Near the control room door, Aurelia Network's senior broadcast standards officer, Odette Kincaid, photographed the 8:31 p.m. revision timestamp and placed the original rundown under an internal preservation hold. Someone had rewritten her silence. Gideon called the changes a necessary adjustment for younger viewers, speaking with the polished patience he reserved for decisions already made. He said Corinne had better energy for television and reminded Ayanna that the evening was about protecting Devereux Global's $3.6 billion valuation. Behind him, city light flashed across the wet glass as lightning rolled somewhere south of Interstate 20. You only need to be present. 15 years earlier, Ayanna had written the speech that secured Gideon's first $2.4 million investment while they worked above a laundromat near downtown on Auburn Avenue. Now 14 feet separated them, but the distance felt larger than every road they had crossed together. Through the open door, she could see sponsors drinking sparkling water in the executive lounge while Corinne practiced Ayanna's phrases as though they were accessories. He chose optics. Gideon believed a title created ownership, a camera created truth, and a husband could edit his wife out of history without disturbing the value of the company. He had forgotten that Ayanna had established the narrative provenance reversion instrument through Pembroke Analytics, the research company that owned Lattice 9's behavioral methodology and licensed it to Devereux Global. He had also forgotten the deferred influence capital waterfall, which could redirect protected earnings the moment authorship was publicly misrepresented. Not yet. A stage manager appeared at 8:58 p.m. and announced 90 seconds to air while thunder pressed a low vibration through the floor. Corinne repeated a line about trust being the most expensive asset in business, unaware Ayanna had written it on a legal pad during a midnight bus ride in 2011. Gideon smiled and told Corinne she understood his brand better than anyone. Ayanna said nothing. Rain raced down the high windows as camera pedestals rolled into position beneath the cold studio lights. Red tally lamps blinked on one by one, and the audience settled into tiered seats opposite a curved wall of blue LED panels displaying Gideon's name in 12-foot letters. A production assistant offered Ayanna a hand she did not need as the opening music rose through the soundstage. Places. Ayanna walked onto the set with measured steps, hearing her heels strike the polished floor beneath the applause. The screen introduced Gideon as visionary founder, Corinne as creative partner, and Ayanna with a smaller caption that erased every professional credential she possessed. Gideon leaned toward Corinne before the first question, already performing intimacy for the widest camera. Ayanna, wife. At 9:01 p.m., 312 guests sat in tiered seating opposite the curved LED wall as the host welcomed a projected live audience of 12 million and asked how loyalty had shaped the Devereux success story. Corinne turned toward the camera with practiced sympathy, while Gideon rested one hand along the back of her chair. Ayanna heard the opening sentence of the life they planned to steal from her, delivered in words she had once written. And she remembered everything. The host's smile held steady beneath the white studio lamps as rain streamed across the windows 38 floors above Peachtree Street. At 9:04 p.m., 312 guests sat in tiered seating opposite the curved LED wall as camera one moved into its first close-up of Gideon. Gideon leaned back in his navy Brioni suit, his polished cuff links flashing each time the camera moved toward him. "We built it together." Corinne turned toward him in her champagne silk dress, placing one hand lightly against the arm of her chair as though she had rehearsed the gesture. She described the first Devereux global office, the nights Gideon worked without sleep, and the fear he supposedly carried before his first $2.4 million investment meeting. Every detail came from private notes Ayanna had written during 15 years of marriage. She stole the history cleanly. The host looked toward Ayanna and asked whether those early years had been difficult for her as well. Before Ayanna could answer, Corinne laughed softly and said Ayanna had never been interested in business, only in creating a comfortable home for Gideon. Gideon smiled beneath the brightest bank of lights, while 6 feet away, near the dark edge of the curved set, Ayanna sat perfectly still where the weaker side lighting left half her face in shadow. She preferred the background. The control room clock reached 9:07 p.m., and a producer counted down the next segment through the host's earpiece. Outside, lightning illuminated the Bank of America Plaza, turning its gold crown white for a single second before the city returned to blue-black rain. Inside, Gideon laughed when Corinne repeated Ayanna's line about trust being the most expensive asset in business. The audience applauded. Ayanna felt the cool seam of her satin lapel beneath her fingertips and listened without interrupting. She noticed Corinne misstate the opening year of the company by 14 months and placed the original office on Piedmont Avenue instead of Auburn Avenue. She noticed Gideon correct neither error. She noticed the host's questions had been arranged to make Corinne appear intimate, informed, and indispensable. Nothing escaped her. At 9:12 p.m., Gideon announced that Corinne would serve as creative producer of the official documentary series, The Devereux Legacy, a 6-part project valued at $18 million. He said Corinne possessed the rare ability to understand his sacrifices and translate them for a new generation. Then he turned toward Ayanna with the warm public smile he had practiced in mirrors for years. "You never wanted that responsibility." Corinne added that the documentary would finally reveal the emotional cost of Gideon's marriage to a woman who had doubted his vision. The host lowered her voice and asked Ayanna whether she regretted failing to support him during the company's earliest years. Camera 4 moved closer, waiting for humiliation, anger, or tears. Ayanna gave them none. "Who told you that story?" Corinne's smile widened as the red tally light reflected in her earrings. Gideon looked amused, as if the answer were too obvious to deserve explanation. Behind the studio glass, Odette Kincaid watched the waveform of the live feed and opened the protected archive console at 9:14 p.m. She preserved the unedited signal. Corinne said Gideon had told her everything during long evenings when he finally felt understood. Gideon placed his hand across the back of her chair and nodded for the camera. Ayanna looked from Corinne to her husband, giving him one final opportunity to correct the lie. He chose silence. During the commercial break, a network attorney approached Gideon with the final amendment to the broadcast persona delegation schedule, which his media counsel had prepared 3 days earlier to expand Corinne's access to the documentary archive. The document granted Corinne provisional access to selected biographical materials, executive interviews, and private narrative assets for the documentary. Gideon reviewed the executive summary, ignored the incorporated schedules, and signed the acknowledgement page without asking which superior rights remained in force. The stylist made a dry, deliberate scrape across the glass, and the confirmation seal appeared in cold blue light. Ayanna heard the sound clearly. The acknowledgement page expressly preserved every superior authorship right previously established under the narrative provenance reversion instrument and the reputation architecture source stewardship mandate. Gideon saw the language, but never considered what it could cost him. At 9:17 p.m., the program returned live, and Corinne began describing Ayanna's own sacrifices as evidence of Gideon's loneliness. Rain hammered the windows while Atlanta's towers burned gold against the storm. Under the lights, Gideon smiled as though he had replaced his wife. In the darkness beside him, Ayanna understood that he had just authenticated the mechanism that would return her story. At 10:31 p.m., the closing music rolled across Aurelia Broadcast Center while rain struck the 38th floor windows hard enough to blur every light along Peachtree Street. Gideon stood beneath the brightest studio rig, laughing with Corinne as sponsors from Cartier and Northstar Private Wealth gathered around them with practiced congratulations. 12 feet away, beyond the spill of the key lights, Ayanna remained motionless in a dark corner beside the silent camera tracks, her face calm and unreadable. The show was over. Corinne lifted a glass of sparkling water and accepted praise for understanding Gideon's real journey, though she had misstated 3 dates and 2 company milestones within 90 minutes. Gideon joked that television had finally revealed who truly belonged beside him, and the nearest executives laughed because his company still carried a $3.6 billion valuation. In the shadowed reflection of the rain-black glass, Ayanna watched his smile appear twice, once on his face and once in the window, while her own reflection stood alone between them. He enjoyed the light. At 10:44 p.m., Gideon entered dressing room B and found Ayanna removing the small wireless microphone from her satin lapel. The room smelled of heated cosmetics, damp wool, and the sharp citrus disinfectant used by the overnight cleaning crew. Beyond the glass wall, lightning flashed above Interstate 85, turning Atlanta's towers silver before darkness closed over them again. "You embarrassed me." Ayanna placed the microphone on the counter without answering, and its red indicator faded to black beside a $1,200 Aurelia Cosmetics case. Gideon told her the interview had been harmless, that Corinne was simply more natural on camera, and that a modern audience needed someone warmer than a wife who always looked like she was reviewing financial statements. He said Ayanna's presence had still served its purpose because viewers had seen stability, elegance, and a marriage that reassured investors. She heard the transaction clearly. Gideon loosened his Brioni tie and explained that the documentary would strengthen the next $400 million capital raise. He said Corinne would handle the public narrative while Ayanna could continue doing what she had always done quietly, without titles or unnecessary attention. Under the dressing room bulbs, he smiled at his own solution, while in the unlit corner near the wardrobe rack, Ayanna stood perfectly still and allowed him to mistake silence for surrender. No. She crossed the 9-foot room and opened a recessed display case built into the wall beside his mirror. Inside rested the first cue sheet she had written for him in 2011, sealed between 2 acrylic panels and preserved like a relic from the days when they could barely afford the $1,800 monthly rent above a laundromat on Auburn Avenue. The handwritten line at the bottom remained visible beneath the studio glare. "Never perform certainty you have not earned." He had forgotten the handwriting. Ayanna released the clasp and lifted the cue sheet from its frame. The only sound was the brittle crack of the acrylic edge as the old display seal split beneath her thumb. She laid the paper beside the dead microphone, aligning both objects with the careful precision of someone closing an account. Nothing shook. Gideon glanced at the cue sheet and said she was turning a television appearance into a personal crisis. He reminded her, that every major biographical asset had already been delegated through the broadcast persona delegation schedule, and that Corin's role had been approved by his media office. Ayanna knew the signature he had placed at 9:15 p.m. had also authenticated the superior claims buried beneath it. The narrative provenance reversion instrument, the reputation architecture source stewardship mandate, and the deferred influence capital waterfall. He had signed the door open. At 10:51 p.m., Ayanna picked up her coat and looked once at the man she had taught to speak with authority. Rain rolled down the windows behind him, and the cold white bulbs sharpened every line of confidence on his face. Gideon asked whether she expected him to chase her through the hallway like a character in one of Corin's documentaries. Revenge is loud. Ayanna opened the door as thunder moved across downtown Atlanta, and the production floor emptied into blue security lighting. She paused only long enough to look back at the cue sheet resting beside the extinguished microphone. Then she gave him the sentence he would remember long after the applause disappeared. This is the consequence. At 11:03 p.m., Ayanna left through the technical exit on William Street and stepped into rain that soaked the shoulders of her black coat within seconds. She crossed 40 yards to a gray Lincoln sedan she had rented under her own name, passing satellite trucks that still carried Gideon's face across their glowing monitors. From the upper windows, city lights burned gold against the storm while the marriage beneath them went cold without spectacle. She never looked back. Gideon returned to the sponsor reception and laughed beneath the chandeliers as though the evening had ended in victory. In the dark parking lane below, Ayanna entered a 6-digit authentication code and authorized her counsel to serve the dissolution petition and notify the independent trustee overseeing her separately owned intellectual property and protected influence reserves. At 7:12 the next morning, Gideon's general counsel received a sealed digital notice placing $286 million in protected royalties and influence reserves under independent trustee review. The consequence had arrived. At 7:12 a.m., rain still veiled downtown Atlanta when the cobalt-sealed notice appeared in Devereux Global's secure legal portal and on the encrypted display of its general counsel. The city below Peachtree Center glowed pale gold through the storm, while wet traffic crawled along Cortlandt Street like red beads beneath the glass. Gideon entered the boardroom carrying a fresh coffee and the confidence of a man who believed every problem had a public relations solution. Remove it. Outside counsel had been reviewing the 184-page filing since 5:30 a.m. By the time 11 attorneys assembled around the 12-foot walnut table, each had reached the same conclusion. The notice activated the narrative provenance reversion instrument across 3,842 speeches, interviews, executive profiles, campaign scripts, and documentary assets created since March 2011. It also suspended every downstream use of Ayanna's name, likeness, recorded testimony, and private history until authorship could be independently authenticated. The room went cold. Gideon laughed beneath the recessed ceiling lights and told the legal team that his wife was staging an expensive tantrum, while 4.8 miles east, in the shadowed conference room of a modest office on Edgewood Avenue, Ayanna sat still beside a rain-dark window and reviewed the same pages without expression. His coffee steamed beneath polished brass fixtures. Her tea had already gone cold. She wrote speeches. The lead counsel, Martin Quill, explained that the filing did not treat the material as ordinary publicity. The superior claim identified Ayanna as the originating narrative architect and linked every derivative asset to the reputation architecture source stewardship mandate. Because Gideon had publicly validated Corin's false attribution through the broadcast persona delegation schedule, the reversion process had been automatically triggered subject to independent verification. He had authenticated his own loss. At 7:39 a.m., Aurelia Network's documentary division received a formal rights suspension notice covering the Devereux legacy, the $18 million series announced less than 11 hours earlier. Editors retained the files in read-only preservation storage but lost authority to edit, distribute, or commercially exploit 611 hours of archival footage, 94 recorded interviews, and the private origin chronology Corinne had planned to narrate. The production portal changed from green to gray, and the word Source Authority Withdrawn appeared across every workstation. The project stopped breathing. Gideon called the studio president and demanded that filming continue under his personal approval. The answer arrived at 7:46 a.m. His approval no longer established provenance. Outside, rain struck the glass hard enough to tremble the aluminum window frames. Fix it. On Edgewood Avenue, Odette Kincaid entered Ayana's temporary office carrying a cobalt encrypted drive no larger than a matchbox. It contained the untouched live feed, the cue sheet revisions, the control room timestamps, and Gideon's recorded instruction to reduce Ayana's responses before broadcast. Odette placed it on the table beside a printed authentication custody ledger. The security seal locked into place with a firm click. Ayana signed the custody acknowledgement while Odette's preservation seal generated a cryptographic hash and transferred the master recording into immutable compliance storage, making any later alteration immediately detectable. She did not upload the footage, call a reporter, or issue a statement. She simply secured the truth. Not yet. By 8:18 a.m., Gideon's attorneys discovered the second layer. Lattice 9, the reputation engine supporting 62% of Devereux Global's premium accounts, was governed by Ayana's reputation architecture source stewardship mandate. Its sentiment library, crisis-weighting logic, and behavioral forecasting models could not be copied, modified, or commercially deployed after an authorship repudiation event. The operating authorization would expire in 72 hours. The Empire had a clock. Gideon stood beneath the boardroom lights and mocked the warning as technical theater, while in the darker office across town, Ayana watched Dawn struggle through the rain and quietly approved 12 notices to partners using her work. His executives studied him with growing uncertainty. Her screen reflected no triumph. At 8:31 a.m., the first 3 licensing portals shifted into read-only preservation mode, while Lattice 9's commercial operating authority continued its 72-hour cure period. A thin glass authorization token on Gideon's table flashed red. When he pressed his thumb against it, a fine crack traveled along the embedded verification line with a clean, brittle snap. Gideon stopped smiling. Outside, Atlanta's towers shimmered above streets washed silver by the storm. Inside Devereux Global, the man who had claimed the story finally learned that the story had an owner. At 9:06 a.m., the 72-hour countdown appeared across the executive dashboard at Devereux Global while rain pressed a gray curtain against the 46th-floor windows. Below, headlights moved slowly along Peachtree Street, and the gold crown of Bank of America Plaza faded behind low clouds. Gideon stood beneath the boardroom's recessed lights, laughing as he told 12 executives that Ayana had built nothing a qualified engineering team could not reproduce. Replace her. Across town, Ayana sat motionless in the dim Edgewood Avenue office where only a brass desk lamp illuminated the cobalt drive beside her hand. The room smelled of wet concrete, cedar tea, and printer toner, while water traced narrow paths down the window overlooking Edgewood Avenue. Odette watched Ayana open the reputation architecture source stewardship mandate and authenticate the withdrawal of the methodology, decision architecture, and protected logic modules developed by Pembroke Analytics and licensed to Devereux Global. Proceed. At 9:18 a.m., 62% of Devereux Global's premium client systems received notices that their current architecture would enter preservation mode. The mandate did not erase data or interrupt public services. It simply removed the company's authority to modify, commercialize, or claim ownership of Ayana's protected framework. Gideon's replacement team discovered that the visible dashboard exposed fewer than 9% of Lattice 9's deployable logic modules. The intelligence had left first. Gideon remained beneath the bright conference lights, joking that his wife had mistaken documentation for genius. While in the darker office, 4.8 miles east, Ayana quietly reviewed every safeguard before approving the next instrument. His attorney spoke over one another beside untouched breakfast worth $860. Her desk held a legal pad, a cup of cold tea, and the original architecture map she had drawn during a midnight bus ride 15 years earlier. She needed nothing else. At 9:41 a.m., Ayanna activated the Deferred Influence Capital waterfall. The mechanism immediately froze Gideon's distribution authority and instructed the independent trustee to begin a 5-business-day reallocation of $286 million in accumulated royalties, deferred authorship proceeds, and protected influence reserves. A separate equity restoration priority schedule identified another $34 million in disputed creator proceeds and placed the funds into protected escrow pending final attribution review. Money followed provenance. Gideon ordered Martin Quill to freeze the transfer, but the lead counsel explained that the waterfall was administered by an independent trustee, remained outside ordinary executive discretion, and had been ratified before Devereux Global's first institutional financing round. Gideon had signed the original instrument in 2012 because Ayanna told him it would reassure investors that intellectual assets could survive leadership misconduct. He had never imagined the misconduct would be his. Stop saying her name. At 10:03 a.m., Ayanna placed a new filing on the table. Pembroke Voice Equity, a public benefit enterprise bearing the surname she had never surrendered. Its charter established Pembroke Voice Equity as a public benefit technology company supported by an independent nonprofit legal clinic, with 30% of annual net proceeds committed to authorship recovery grants. Odette slid the incorporation tablet toward her as thunder rolled over downtown Atlanta. The only sound was the soft tap of the stylus as Ayanna's signature sealed the Pembroke Authorship Equity Charter in cobalt light. It was hers. The Edgewood Avenue building had been leased 3 weeks earlier by a holding company under Ayanna's control. At 10:17 a.m., its operating rights, 12 prepared workstations, and a $48 million reserve facility were formally assigned to Pembroke Voice Equity. Ayanna approved recruitment for intellectual property counsel, data engineers, forensic editors, and financial recovery specialists. Their first client was Loretta Gaines, a hospital nurse whose case Ayanna had reviewed confidentially for 19 days after a national campaign raised $7.2 million from her life story, without giving her control over her name or testimony. The work began quietly. At Devereux Global, Gideon laughed beneath the lights and promised investors that normal access would return by noon. While in the shadowed Pembroke office, Ayanna sat beside Loretta and listened without interrupting. His company prepared another statement. Her company prepared evidence. At 11:26 a.m., the first major investor called Ayanna directly and asked whether Pembroke could rebuild the reputation infrastructure Devereux Global no longer controlled. She looked through the rain at Atlanta's high-rise lights flickering against the storm-darkened skyline, then closed Gideon's file without answering immediately. The cobalt drive disappeared into its secure case with a soft final click. Ayanna had not taken his empire. She had reclaimed the part that was always hers. At 6:40 p.m., 43 days after Pembroke Voice Equity opened, freezing rain glazed the windows of Devereux Global's 46th-floor command room. Atlanta's towers shimmered through the storm. Their white and amber lights fractured across the wet glass, while traffic crawled below on Peachtree Street. Gideon stood beneath a ring of studio-grade ceiling lights, smiling for a private investor webcast as though the company's $1.1 billion valuation loss were a temporary accounting inconvenience. We are fully operational. Only 4.8 miles east. Ayanna sat perfectly still in the dim third-floor strategy room of Pembroke Voice Equity, where a single brass lamp illuminated the Lattice 9 architecture map spread across a black oak table. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking Edgewood Avenue, and the distant city lights glowed behind her like muted constellations. Odette placed the morning performance report beside her cold tea without interrupting the silence. The numbers were enough. At 6:52 p.m., Devereux Global released Meridian Pulse after spending $38 million to acquire a 6-month-old vendor prototype, rename it, and assigned 126 engineers across 3 consulting firms to compress 12 weeks of safety testing into 43 days. Within 11 minutes, the system classified a hospital memorial campaign as a retail opportunity and inserted a discount message beneath the names of deceased donors. By 7:09 p.m., screenshots had reached 480,000 users and 6 major sponsors had requested emergency review. Before midnight, the audience would exceed 4.8 million. The launch collapsed in public. Gideon laughed under the webcast lights and called the error an isolated calibration issue. While in the shadowed Pembroke conference room, Ayanna remained calm as her analyst verified that no protected Lattice 9 logic had been copied. His communications team drafted 5 explanations in 30 minutes. Her team drafted none. Let the record speak. At 7:26 p.m., Northstar Private Wealth invoked the material adverse change provision within its reputation exposure withdrawal schedule and suspended a pending $240 million placement that had not yet been funded. 2 healthcare networks followed under the institutional trust continuity schedule, and a national insurer froze all Dever media spending pending independent provenance review. The partner exodus was not emotional. Every withdrawal cited measurable governance risk. Confidence had changed direction. Corinne appeared on a live business program at 8:03 p.m. wearing ivory silk and a diamond collar borrowed from sponsor. She insisted Meridian Pulse had been designed before Ayanna became involved, then misstated the company's founding year, confused Lattice 9 with a consumer app, and claimed Gideon personally wrote the underlying behavioral models. The anchor asked for one technical example, and Corinne stared into the camera for 4 silent seconds. The lights exposed everything. Gideon watched from the illuminated executive suite and forced a laugh for the advisors surrounding him. While across town, Ayanna sat in darkness near the rain-streaked window and closed Corinne's interview without replaying it. His face appeared on 3 wall monitors at once. Hers was reflected only faintly in the Cobalt Drive case beside her hand. She needed no audience. At 8:31 p.m., Martin Quill entered Gideon's office carrying the final partner ledger and a sealed executive credibility impairment notice. The document triggered the board confidence escalation matrix, requiring an emergency vote if verified misrepresentation caused losses exceeding $500 million within a fiscal quarter. Gideon reached for the authorization stylus, but the tablet rejected his credentials. The notice had already frozen his emergency signing authority pending the board hearing. His authority had narrowed. The only sound was the sharp fracture of Gideon's glass investor token as its embedded status filament turned red and split beneath the pressure of his thumb. He stared at the broken piece on the walnut table while freezing rain rattled the windows behind him. Beyond the glass, Atlanta's high-rise lights burned against the dark storm, bright enough to reveal the emptiness of the room. No one laughed. At 9:14 p.m., Ayanna approved Pembroke Voice Equity's 17th recovery action, restoring authorship revenue to 4 women whose work had been absorbed into national campaigns. The Equity Restoration Priority Schedule authorized $6.3 million for transfer into protected accounts, with settlement scheduled for the next business day. She signed each release beneath the brass lamp, then closed the file and looked out at the rain. Her company was growing. At Devereux Global, the board scheduled a removal hearing for 8 o'clock the next morning. Corinne stopped answering Gideon's calls at 9:37 p.m., 3 minutes after her booking agent warned that her next sponsored appearance had been placed under review. He stood alone beneath the executive lights, surrounded by screens that no longer obeyed him. Across the city, Ayanna turned off the lamp and left the room in silence. The empire had not fallen in one dramatic moment. It was simply discovering how expensive borrowed brilliance could become. At 7:58 a.m., freezing rain still streaked the 46-floor windows when the 11-member board assembled around the walnut table at Devereux Global. Atlanta's towers floated in the gray storm, their gold and white lights trembling above wet streets and slow traffic on Peachtree Center Avenue. Gideon entered beneath the bright recessed lamps wearing a charcoal chiton suit and the thin smile he had used through every failed quarter. This will take 10 minutes. Exactly 4.8 miles east, Ayanna sat motionless in the unlit records room of Pembroke Voice Equity while Dawn struggled through the rain-dark windows on Edgewood Avenue. A single monitor illuminated the Cobalt drive, the authentication custody ledger, and the original broadcast timeline preserved by Odette Kincaid. Outside her door, 17 employees prepared recovery filings for women whose work had been taken without credit. She waited. At 8:06 a.m., Martin Quill opened the board confidence escalation matrix and documented $1.34 billion in lost valuation, 9 suspended partnerships, and 27 premium clients requesting migration from Meridian Pulse. Gideon forced a thin smile beneath the conference lights and blamed a coordinated campaign led by his estranged wife. At the darker end of Pembroke's records room, Ayanna remained perfectly still as Odette transmitted the unedited Aurelia footage through the broadcast integrity preservation schedule. His accusation created noise. Her evidence created sequence. Play it. The board watched Gideon order producers to remove Ayanna's professional credentials, reduce her answers, and redirect questions to Corinne. They heard Corinne rehearse phrases taken from Ayanna's private archive and saw Gideon authorize the broadcast persona delegation schedule, despite the superior authorship warning displayed on its final page. The room remained silent for 53 seconds after the recording ended. The truth required no commentary. At 8:31 a.m., the board invoked the Executive Credibility Impairment Notice and opened a formal removal vote under the Fiduciary Narrative Accuracy Standard. Gideon insisted the documents concerned image management rather than corporate governance. But Martin explained that false provenance had been used to support the $400 million capital raise. 3 directors who had defended Gideon the previous week changed their votes after reviewing the authenticated chain. Loyalty followed liability. Under the bright boardroom lights, Gideon adjusted his tie, searched the directors' faces for support, and accused them of allowing Ayanna's paperwork to dictate corporate policy. While in the shadowed Pembroke records room, Ayanna calmly closed the footage window and turned her attention to Loretta Gaines's authorship recovery. His hands tightened around a silver presentation remote. Hers rested loosely beside a legal pad. 9-2. The board removed Gideon as chief executive, revoked his committee appointments, signing authority, and executive decision-making powers, and appointed an interim chief executive under the supervision of the Special Committee on IP and Disclosure Integrity. His portrait vanished from the executive dashboard before the secretary finished reading the resolution. The only sound was the dry snap of the silver presentation remote breaking inside Gideon's clenched hand. One half struck the walnut table and spun beneath the cold white lights. No one reached for it. Corinne appeared on morning television at 9:12 a.m. in an ivory silk dress and announced that she had also been misled by Gideon. She claimed Ayanna had controlled the marriage through obscure financial instruments, then revealed private discussions about removing Ayanna from the documentary and replacing her name in the origin story. Her attempt to save herself completed the evidence chain against him. Attention turned predatory. At 9:29 a.m., Corinne's jewelry sponsor suspended its arrangement pending a formal credibility review, and Aurelia Network placed her 3 scheduled appearances on hold. She called Gideon once, asked whether he could still guarantee her producer title, and ended the call when he could not. By 9:34, she had removed every photograph of him from her public profile. The light had moved on. Gideon stood alone in the illuminated boardroom, while employees outside surrendered their executive access credentials into a locked steel tray. Across the city, Ayanna sat in the dim Pembroke office beside Loretta and signed a $6.3 million equity restoration priority release returning campaign proceeds to 4 erase creators. The Cobalt signature seal closed over Ayanna's name with a deliberate click. Her work continued. At 10:16 a.m., Gideon returned to his private office and found the first Q sheet inside a plain archival envelope returned by Aurelia Network's legal division. Facilities had placed his deactivated executive badge beneath Ayanna's handwritten warning. Beyond the glass, freezing rain blurred Atlanta's high-rise lights into pale streaks. For the first time, Gideon had no camera, no audience, and no borrowed sentence to hide behind. 5 years after Pembroke Voice Equity outgrew its original Edgewood Avenue offices, a warm spring rain silvered the windows of its new 12-story headquarters on Auburn Avenue. Atlanta's skyline glowed beyond the glass, its amber office lights floating above wet streets where black cars moved slowly toward the opening of the company's 10th National Center. Inside, 640 guests gathered beneath suspended brass lights to celebrate an institution that had recovered $418 million for 1,306 women whose names, work, or personal histories had been used without proper authority. Pembroke had become the name. Ayanna stood in the dim west corridor beyond the auditorium, dressed in an ivory-tailored suit with no visible logo and only a pair of small diamond earrings. Odette Kincaid reviewed the final event schedule beside her while rain tapped against the narrow windows and the scent of white tea drifted from the reception hall. On the stage 30 yards away, a 12-foot screen displayed the Pembroke Voice Equity seal above the words "Authorship is ownership." She needed no introduction. At 6:57 p.m., Gideon Devereux entered through the public entrance without an assistant, security detail, or media advisor. His charcoal suit remained expensive, but 5 years without cameras had softened the certainty in his posture. He paused beneath the brightest lobby lights when a former investor failed to recognize him. While beyond the curtain in the darker wing of the auditorium, Ayanna stood perfectly still and listened as the audience applauded women whose stories had survived institutions designed to erase them. The contrast required no explanation. He came alone. Gideon carried a plain archival envelope containing the original 2011 Q sheet and a printed acknowledgement governed by the Personal Narrative Restitution Declaration. The document admitted that Ayanna had originated the founding language, reputation architecture, and public philosophy later presented as his personal brilliance. It also surrendered every residual claim under the Legacy Attribution Priority Schedule and waived any future use of her name in promotional materials. There was nothing left to negotiate. At 7:12 p.m., Ayanna walked onto the stage as the rain intensified against the high windows and the lights of Bank of America Plaza shimmered through the glass behind her. She announced a $60 million expansion of the Pembroke Protected Voice Fund, including legal assistance, data forensic support, and emergency operating grants for women earning less than $75,000 a year. The audience rose before she finished the final sentence. Her success had its own evidence. Gideon watched from the last row beneath a recessed light, attempting to smile when the cameras crossed his face, while Ayanna stood calmly at the center of the stage where no shadow could reduce her to someone else's wife. His applause came late. Her proof had arrived years earlier. At 8:26 p.m., during the intermission before the final presentation, Gideon waited in a quiet reading room overlooking rain-slicked Auburn Avenue. The room smelled of leather bindings, wet pavement, and the cedar polish used on the long oak table. When Ayanna entered, Gideon placed the archival envelope between them and said he had spent 5 years learning the difference between losing control and never having earned it. I was wrong. He admitted that Corinne had left 14 days after his removal, that his remaining personal stake in Devereux Global had eventually been sold for $312 million, and that no advisor had been able to rebuild the voice Ayanna created. He said he no longer wanted the company, the cameras, or the version of himself the public once admired. He wanted another chance. Ayanna listened without interrupting. At 8:34 p.m., Gideon opened the Personal Narrative Restitution Declaration and signed beneath the final acknowledgement line. The only sound was the deliberate scratch of the black stylus across the glass, followed by the soft click of the cobalt seal locking his confession into the Belmanoloco. He pushed the document toward her. She did not touch it. Outside, Atlanta's high-rise lights burned gold through the rain, reflected twice in the window between them. Gideon smiled faintly beneath the reading lamp, hoping humility might reopen what arrogance had closed. While on the darker side of the table, Ayanna remained still enough to make his hope feel like another performance. Gideon asked whether forgiveness might someday leave room for them to begin again. Before Ayanna answered, the stage manager appeared at the door and told her the final presentation was ready. Ayanna looked at the cue sheet inside the envelope and remembered the woman who had once written confidence for a man who had none. She held Gideon's gaze for one quiet second, left the envelope untouched, and returned to the auditorium without answering. Behind her, Gideon remained beside the signed declaration and the question he had waited 5 years to ask. At 8:41 p.m., Ayanna returned to the auditorium while warm rain traced silver lines down the 12-story windows of Pembroke Voice Equity. Atlanta's high-rise lights glowed gold beyond the glass, and the audience of 640 guests settled beneath the suspended brass fixtures as the final presentation began. Gideon remained alone in the reading room, seated beside the signed personal narrative restitution declaration and the cue sheet that had once taught him how to sound certain. On stage, Ayanna faced the camera without anyone speaking for her. The screen behind her displayed the title of Pembroke's newest initiative, the Original Voice Archive. It would preserve unedited interviews, authorship histories, source files, and verified creative records for women whose stories have been rewritten by employers, spouses, institutions, or public figures. The archive's first entry belonged to Ayanna herself. 5 years earlier, millions of viewers had watched Corinne Fairchild describe Ayanna as an ornamental wife who had never understood Gideon's ambitions. Authenticated archival footage appeared beside the original Aurelia broadcast, showing Ayanna drafting the language that secured Gideon's first $2.4 million investment, directing the team that built Lattice 9, and establishing the financial safeguards that later protected its creators. No dramatic music played. The evidence was enough. At 8:47 p.m., Aurelia Network made the full 90-minute broadcast available through its public archive under a disclosure provision approved by its legal division, while the auditorium screen played authenticated excerpts and Odette certified the integrity of the preserved master. Viewers saw Gideon instruct producers to remove Ayanna's credentials, watch Corinne rehearse Ayanna's private phrases, and heard the control room confirm that Ayanna's answers had been deliberately cut. The same network that once reduced her to the word wife now carried her uninterrupted voice nationwide. She had taken back her story. Ayanna did not use the moment to insult Gideon or Corinne. Instead, she told the country how a scholarship student from a working-class Atlanta neighborhood had built the language, behavioral architecture, and financial safeguards behind an empire that later tried to erase her. She explained how public narratives become financial assets, how erased authorship can distort ownership, and why women without wealth often lose both recognition and income when someone more powerful controls the microphone. She then announced that the Pembroke Protected Voice Fund would provide 10,000 hours of free legal and forensic support during its first year. Her victory created access. In the reading room, Gideon watched the broadcast on a small wall monitor. Under the soft lamp, he finally saw the difference between being humiliated and being accurately revealed. Ayanna had not invented a harsher version of him. She had simply removed the edits that once protected him. Corinne sent no statement. Her brief career as a storyteller had ended when the source material stopped belonging to her. At 9:02 p.m., the audience rose as women featured in the Original Voice Archive joined Ayanna on stage. Loretta Gaines stood beside her with the hospital campaign Rights Restore to her name, while engineers, writers, designers, and researchers filled the stage beneath the Pembroke seal. Outside, the rain began to soften, and the city lights sharpened across the wet streets of Auburn Avenue. The storm had passed without asking permission. After the presentation, Gideon met Ayanna in the glass corridor overlooking downtown. He said he finally understood that an apology could acknowledge the past without purchasing a place in her future. Ayanna told him she no longer carried anger for what he had done. She no longer needed proof of who she had been. Gideon asked the question he had left unfinished in the reading room, whether forgiveness meant there was still a version of the story in which they found their way back to each other. Ayanna looked through the rain at the city she had crossed alone 5 years earlier, then toward the auditorium where hundreds of women now stood beneath their own names. Her answer was calm, complete, and free of anger. My story stays mine. She walked away without triumph because she no longer required his defeat to confirm her worth. Forgiveness did not rebuild the life Gideon had broken. It simply allowed Ayanna to leave its ruins without carrying them any farther. Ayanna reclaimed more than money, authorship, or public recognition. She reclaimed the right to define herself in words no one else could edit. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.